From Islamic finance to Jewish Jubilee laws, from Hindu dharmic economics to the Catholic concept of the common good, faith traditions have always had something to say about how economies should be organized. And yet today's global economy is largely discussed as if it operates beyond the reach of values. Can faith communities help us reimagine what an economy is actually for? I'm Gopal Patel.
And I am Sulaima Gourani, and you are listening to Faith in Action, an independent podcast by members of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Faith in Action. The views expressed here do not necessarily reflect the views of the World Economic Forum.
Today we have two wonderful guests. We first have Tariq Al-Olaimy, who is co-founder of a global ecosystem of social and planetary enterprises, including 3BL Associates, Nature on Board, Recipes for Wellbeing, and FutureFaith. He is a global ambassador for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and is an advisory board member to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration.
And our other guest is Brie Loskota. She brings 25 years of experience at the intersection of religion and the public square. She is a partner at BALM Strategies, a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and on the board of the Los Angeles Emergency Preparedness Foundation. Welcome both. It is so nice to have you here today, and I hope that you're doing really, really well. From your perspective, both of you, what does a moral economy mean, and what does it actually look like? And what does your tradition say about how wealth, work, and exchange should be organized? I don't know who wants to go first, but what are your thoughts on the moral economy? What does it mean, and what does it actually look like?
Thank you, Salima. Thank you, Gopal. Thank you, Brie. It's wonderful being in conversation together. And that question is something I think about every day. And I've kept coming back to the same very simple observation that for me around the moral economy, every single week, billions of people gather in mosques and churches and temples, gurdwaras, synagogues around the world. They pray, they reflect, they contemplate their responsibilities towards creation, to their community, to future generations. And then the weeks continue. And then probably on Monday, their investments that fund their pension funds and portfolios work against the very values that they hold sacred, that the jobs that they work at, that the economy that they keep sustaining is something that is probably a deep gap between the very values that they've processed on the weekend. So we pray with our deepest values, always on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, usually, depending on the tradition, and then invest against them on Monday. And for me, the immoral economy is the gap between those values. And it's a gap that I've been trying to solve through my work. And, for me, an immoral economy, I think, is important as well to define in comparison to a moral economy, which is one where it's easier to make money off money than off dignified work, where, an immoral economy is where GDP goes up when we cut down forests. You can get rich speculating on food prices while people starve, that you can bet on poly market around whether a war is going to happen or not and be rich on that basis. And a system that doesn't just damage ecosystems, it severs the very relationships our faiths teach us that are sacred. So for me, that is what a moral economy is. That's the gap. And when it comes to my own personal tradition, which is the Islamic tradition, we often go to Islamic finance, which is the largest moral economy movement in the world. And there, what a moral economy means is incredibly specific. It means the prohibition of riba, the prohibition of interest. It rejects the idea that we should make money off money without creating real value. There is a mandatory zakat, which is a 2.5 annual wealth tax at a minimum, where it mandates wealth circulation rather than allowing it to concentrate. Every single investment must be tied to real economic activity, that there are risk-sharing partnerships, that you can't have debt. It means that financiers and communities succeed or fail together. And you cannot profit from someone else's loss. So you can't invest in military arms. You can't, by nature, invest in things that are harmful to human beings. So for me, that's what a moral economy and a moral economy is, and what my tradition has something to say about it.
Wonderful, Tariq. That's a very good kickoff and a lot of food for thoughts. Brie, what are your thoughts on moral economy and what does it actually look like? And what does, I mean, you are interfaith really deeply, but what does your tradition or traditions say about how wealth, work, and exchange should be?
When it comes to understanding moral economy, I think you have to first get over the hurdle that talking about money is a problem, or that talking about money at all is something done in hushed tones and voices. The notion of a moral economy is really, how does money produce justice, right? How does what we labor for, what we prioritize, what we value, produce human flourishing and justice? How does it create an abundance that puts people first, right, rather than profits first? I think it's a fairly simple notion. What is it that you care most about, and does what you do with your money align with it, right? So that the way that you earn and the way that you spend are in alignment with the values that should guide your life. And I think sometimes it gets reduced to things that are sort of the bad ways to make money, right? Whether it's arms or tobacco or alcohol or pornography or things like that. So we can find a sort of like minimum standard where people will say these are the bad things, right? So we want to eliminate the things that are the worst in the way that we produce money. And that's just the floor. That's not the ceiling, right? So what is available to us when we start thinking about money a as a entity, as a concept, right? As an abstraction with morality attached to it, the sky is the limit, right? You can think beyond the vice economy. You can think out beyond arms and war, and you can start to think about not just what you eliminate, but what you produce. And I think the concept of a moral economy helps us think about how we produce more human flourishing, how we produce more justice, how we produce a world where people are not exploited, right? If at the heart of injustice is some form of exploitation, then how do we produce labor without exploitation? How do we produce wealth without exploitation? And what does my tradition say? I mean, I come from many different traditions. So I was born into a Pentecostal family. And there's a lot in Pentecostalism about prosperity. But the Pentecostalism that I grew up with was sort of grounded in the developing world. I was born in the Philippines, which nobody ever guesses. And and so I think that the idea that God wants you to prosper has really profound notions for people who have been subject to systems of poverty and exploitation. But that God wants you to prosper, and that prosperity looks like traditional forms of material wealth, I think is a sort of a skew on what that could potentially means. And so maybe prosperity doesn't mean that you have a nice suit and you drive a nice car and you look outwardly as if you are favored, right? Maybe prosperity looks like a life steeped in dignity and community and meaning and purpose. And so perhaps we need to understand prosperity differently.
I like that. I like that perspective. That let's discuss what success looks like and what is true wealth, Brie. And we really appreciate that you are bringing multi-faith thoughts into the conversations. So do you go. So do you, Tariq, also. So that's why this conversation is so valued. Um, Gopal, any
And
questions?
and
Yeah, sorry.
and I was also just going to add on what Bree said, that I think the importance of this conversation, and Bree is also starting point of just how difficult it is sometimes to talk about money, especially in the faith space. And I think why this is also such an interesting conversation is because it's also equally as difficult to talk about faith in economic space, in the context of the private sector and spaces around the World Economic Forum. And one thing I think Bree is a wonderful example of the type of leader we need in the world, who's able to bridge both worlds. But we've been connected to the World Economic Forum for over a decade, and I've sat down with hundreds of leaders who've tried to act according to their deepest beliefs, who've tried to act according to their faith, I've been in rooms of the dairy industry that are made up mostly of Quakers, and they're trying to struggle with trying to make that bridge. I've been in rooms of philanthropists who are trying to, enact their Hindu values, and they've struggled, they've failed, they've tried again, and yet very few would actually openly discuss what is driving their actions. And it wasn't necessarily an economic mindset first or a money mindset first, it was a values mindset first. And I think sometimes the struggles at faith wasn't deemed sophisticated enough for economic discourse. And I think this is why it's such an important conversation, because the reality is faith is embodied economics. There's a long history of faith traditions actually birthing many of our economic practices today. Yet I think in today's world, very much struggle in really building that bridge.
I think sometimes that's the case because people don't really know where their morality and their sense of what is right and wrong it comes from, right? And so it's almost like the sort of water that we swim in. And so there is an intuitive understanding of what is right and wrong for a lot of people, and yet they struggle to understand or articulate what is really motivating them. I remember working with a foundation that was a faith-based foundation, and we were doing the board review packet. And the board review packet, every single board member had a different lens, even though they had an abundance of guidelines, guidelines that I think were frankly unnecessary and unwieldy. Everybody brought a different lens to how they were evaluating the same board docket. And it wasn't until we surfaced what was really important. Do you want to be the funder of last resort, where you want to make sure everybody has exhausted all of these opportunities before they come to you? Do you want to fund the thing that no one else will fund because it's so ambitious or necessary? Do you want to fund something fully or not? I mean, all of these things that are lenses, sort of like when you're at the eye doctor and they go 1 or 2, 3 or 4, right? We have these moral lenses, these like sort of values lenses, but sometimes we can't articulate them. And so it's not until we get into a kind of deliberative conversation with other people where we have a sort of capacious enough environment to say, I'm looking at this through 3 and you're looking at this through 4. And that's why it looks clear to you but blurry to me. Right. And so I am a social thinker. I do my best thinking when I'm in conversation with somebody else. And so I'm not going to sit down and abstractly think about the things that I care about. I'm going to sort of inductively come up with what I think matters as I go through the process of doing it, which I think is a lot of what people do when they engage in moral questions. So we don't have a lot of environments that produce that kind of deliberation and thoughtfulness, and we don't have a lot of systems that enable us to say, I see this differently than you. Let's talk about that difference, because that requires a lot of skill that we are sort of unpracticed at, right? We will negotiate on our positions, right? Tariq wants to make this grant and I want to make that grant. So we'll fight about that. Right? We will fight over it and we'll negotiate. And maybe if we are, really good, he gets half and I get half. And that's like the best day. But we won't understand each other from the perspective of what's motivating our interest in there. Or even more, what's motivating our needs? Like, what is this thing solving for him that I don't see or I don't maybe value because I don't understand? And so we spend a lot of time at the level of positions or decisions, but not a lot of time understanding what motivates those decisions or what's at stake in those decisions. Frankly, because we see understanding as a form of weakness. So engaging in questions about morality and money require a certain amount of safety, but also a certain amount of skill. And both of those are pretty rare commodities.
And I'm wondering if Brie and Tariq, you could speak to any examples, whether it's a community or an institution or an initiative that either of you have been part of that you've seen that has really tried to broker that conversation and bridge that, gap between the private sector, business, finance, and the faith sector. I'm wondering if you can speak to any examples that you know of those.
Yeah, I'm often in the climate and nature spaces. So I've been to more COPs than I care to recall. They're an interesting form of worship in itself, in the altar of climate finance. But I recall a couple of years ago in the region, in the UAE, COP28, a number of high-level faith leaders did gather, and they're brought together around the leadership of Pope Francis, God rest his beautiful memory and soul. And it was around, really looking at what is the root of our climate crisis. And where they ended up in, a large statement was largely around the economy. It was the issue of the economy. And it was very specifically that what tied most faith traditions' economic theology was the concept that there's no growth. There's an endless growth. That nature is circular, that creation is circular, that, of course, the very principles that are basic to all of humanity and everything that we know, that as good as you give more than you take. And that very principle was being violated constantly and to such a structural scale that these faith leaders couldn't reconcile with it. And, it was a long document. And in the end, it's like the final narrative is that we cannot have endless growth. It's just simply not compatible with a moral economy. It's not compatible with life. That what the finance community was trying to push at these COPs was really that you could have this decoupling of economic growth with climate action. And faith leaders, very much from the economic and scientific and theological standpoint, said, no, that isn't possible. We actually must choose life. And sort of fast forward to COP30 in Brazil, and going back to sort of my own tradition, the Islamic tradition, we had this conversation ourselves. And I think one thing I appreciate about the Islamic tradition is we're our biggest self-critics. You're taught to criticize yourself more than anyone else first. You to have any credibility to lay any other critique outwards. And we gathered in the lens of the global ethical stocktake, which what the COP30 presidency had undertaken. There was really tough conversation around, despite Islamic finance on paper, in principle, being deeply aligned with the moral economy, less than 1% of all Islamic finance assets, which is around $8 trillion, goes to climate and nature investment. So clearly there's a gap between what we're saying, what we're professing, what a moral economic system is. And I think what gave me hope with that is that the critique was coming from within the house, that it was being acknowledged that we weren't actually living up fully to the potential of this beautiful system that was gifted to us, and that we profess as a answer to this question of economic growth.
The first center that I was a part of was at USC. It's called the Center for Religion and Civic Culture. And it developed out of the 1992 civil unrest or riots or uprising, depending on who's talking about the beating of Rodney King and the subsequent trial of the police who beat him and then their acquittal. Um, and the person who founded my center was a professor named Don Miller, and he was driving home from LAX, which is a sort of L shape to get to where his house was. And when you go through this L, you get the sort of best view of LA. It's actually where La La Land starts, where they're dancing on the cars. So that on that ramp is what he's driving across as Los Angeles erupts in flames. And when he gets home, he turns the TV on and he sees a man named Reverend Dr. Cecil L. Murray, Chip Murray, who was the head of First AME Church. And Reverend Murray is standing to give voice to the legitimate injustice that the Black community in South Los Angeles had faced since they were allowed to live in the neighborhoods they were allowed to live in. And I say allowed because the neighborhoods in Los Angeles were highly racially restricted. So it was long before the Rodney King verdict that these issues had percolated. But what was so interesting was that he was standing there giving voice to the outrage the community felt, but he was also standing in between the police and the protesters, the rioters and the firefighters, and those are all distinct groups, trying to create enough calm that fires could be um, extinguished. And then he gives this amazing sermon a few days later about how the community set some of the fires, but they didn't start any of them. and talks, sort of rebukes the community for burning down its neighborhood and also rebukes culture for allowing this sort of racist injustice to persist. And after that, his church and several other churches rebuilt South Los Angeles. And they rebuilt South Los Angeles even more effectively than the Secular Business Coalition because they developed these faith-based community economic development corporations that were embedded in the places that they lived, right? They were where people lived, worked, and worshiped. And they did $400 million of economic development around South Los Angeles, just his church, just the famed Renaissance Center. And the center that I eventually worked for and then ran decades later after this, our job was to study that, right? Our job was to understand what was happening, why it was succeeding, why it was failing. Um, and it goes back to the sort of Black church tradition. Martin Luther King said that all labor that uplifts human dignity is important and should be undertaken with painstaking excellence. Right? So there's this notion that labor has dignity, that it is for the uplift of the community, that it's not for personal aggrandizement. And so they rooted this tradition in a vehicle that allowed them to be incredibly sophisticated. And I think, when we think about leadership, we often think about CEOs. Some of the most sophisticated like imagine the leadership capacities you need to have to run a a mega church in an inner city that has a like $100 million plus economic development corporation around it. You not only need to be good with money and people and scripture and tradition, but you also have to have a pastoral quality, right? You have to be a CEO who is also a counselor. I mean, these incredibly sophisticated individuals who pull off, I mean, the entire redevelopment of South Los Angeles, including Crenshaw Boulevard, which is incredibly vital right now, were done by these faith-based economic development corporations that took advantage of government assistance and programs, corporate funding, and they put their money into jobs programs, retraining, buying housing. Um, it was programmatic and it was institutional, right? It created jobs, it created businesses, it lent money, but it also cared about the people within them. And so it's a really interesting thing. It's not just creating, housing for people who didn't have housing. It's creating programs for people in the housing so that they're not warehoused, that they can live and flourish. And so I think, we often dismiss faith communities as places of, where you go and you pray and there is a sense of moral teaching, right? But what's also happening there is a tremendous amount of social innovation, of programmatic work, of money, like the money that flows through. And I don't mean that yes, there is the corruption that happens in faith institutions where money flows through and it flows to a leader or becomes embezzled, and that happens and that is real. And there is also money that flows through these institutions for the purpose of community, using all sorts of instruments to do it, and it's incredible.
Tariq, any thoughts on that?
I, I think it's a perfect example. I use this phrase a lot of the systemic sacred, of why it's important, I think, to bring these communities together. It's where you have the public and private sector's ability to reorganize resources, global resources, community resources, combined with faith and its power to shape values and also mobilize vast physical infrastructure. And it's like so important to have, these sacred civic partnerships that unite the business community, the innovation community, the policy community, because it's in those spaces where faith networks have shown for hundreds of years where new economic models are born, that new economic models that respect planetary boundaries, that ensure human dignity. And I think Brie just showcased such a brilliant example. And we need more economic reimagination in the world. I think we know that. And I think one of the spaces that can come is from this intersection of the systemic sacred, exactly at that point of unity.
And I want to add that the notion that faith communities sort of it's the who's teaching who question. I did a project when I was at the center at USC. I led a project that was evaluating the work of Catholic sisters. Um, it was hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure going to Catholic sisters to support their ministries and their work. And there's a plenty of rich critique to have about Catholic sisters, and it's all legitimate. And to me, they're also the original social innovators, right? So we think about this idea of social innovation as something that's new, that kind of comes out of Silicon Valley or that comes out of a current climate where people are trying to do business for good. But if you look at, monks who brewed beer or Catholic sisters who have like a commercial bakery where they use the baked goods in order to underwrite their ministries. Like, these are forms of social innovation that are hundreds of years old, right? So it's not that we should take anything away from the current crop of social innovators that are coming out of the business world. It's that we don't need to businessify every aspect of life to find its good. We actually might want to look and see what already exists as an economic model or project that predates things like the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, I remember a thing to map Catholic Sisters activity onto the Sustainable Development Goals. And I said, the Catholic Sisters have been doing this work since before there was a UN. What are we doing? So there's a sense of having some degree of humility about the richness of these traditions and not taking a dismissive uh, look at them, and then having this epiphany moment when we realize that they've endured for some reason, right? They have endured, and the reasons that they have endured is not because they are regressive or backward. It's precisely because they continue to evolve, and they have evolved over time to meet the needs of the moment. And that's what's so miraculous about them, right? Is that religious institutions are not static systems. They're incredibly dynamic, and they have a lot to teach us about the survival of ideas of institutions of values over time, right? Not just ones that, we find ourselves enchanted with in the current moment.
I mean, if you look at the faith communities, they have been doing leadership training, I would like to say almost thousands of years, but that's true, right? Even financial literacy. And long before any schools start teaching it, you could learn it from your local church. So very inspirational. Tariq, any final reflections here, or do you feel like we are ready to move into the more personal questions that we are eager to ask you as well?
Well, I'd also say that indeed, when one engages in faith-based economics, you're participating in something that is, older than markets and older than nations, and it's really these practices that are deeply etched into human muscle memory, long before currency or borders defined our human relations. And one thing I would say is very important as well of this intersection of bringing faith into economics is that one, markets have never been neutral. Every market is designed around assumptions. They're designed about assumptions about what matters, about who bears risks, who profits. We have a market and an economy right now that is organized around the theology of endless growth rather than the theology of endless compassion. And we need to be bringing more of these principles, of course, back into our economic systems. And at the same time, and I'll maybe zoom out a little from a community perspective to a bit of a global perspective, which is, faith communities are powerful economic actors. Faith institutions steward at least 8% of all the Earth's habitable land. They own 10% of all commercial forests. They constitute the world's third largest investment group. They run at least half of all the world's schools, hospitals, networks. They form this invisible structure, especially of resilience for the global South. And we can't sideline these institutions that hold moral weight, that hold economic power, that are trying their best to also solve the contradictions within their own movements and groups. And I think it's why this conversation is so important, but it's also why I think that social imagination, reimagining that we need for our economy, part of the answer will come from these communities.
I mean, that is exactly right. And what is so shocking is how we allow people to operate in the world with a degree of illiteracy and incompetence when it comes to understanding these institutions. In fact, it's almost a badge of honor And I think what sort of ignorance is a badge of honor these days, except for that. And it's profound. And so I have done a lot of work on disaster response when it comes to faith communities, understanding how they imagine themselves, understanding how they work with government agencies. And if you don't take religion seriously as an actor in the world, they are not going to stop acting, right? Religious communities are not going to stop acting because they fall outside of the official government, this or that, whatever framework. So you can either include them and reap the benefits of a much more diverse and enriched set of actors, or you can exclude them, but do so at your peril because they will continue to act. They don't feel accountable to, as Tariq said, these systems and governments and treaties and frameworks that have come into existence and fashion after they have, right? They feel accountable to something greater than that. And so to be religiously illiterate and incompetent is not only to miss out on the promise of what faith communities can provide, but it's also to create a new form of risk and peril.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if we can pivot to the act and how maybe the two of you act and show up in the world, because we're talking at faith at an institutional level, but it's obviously a very deeply personal issue as well. So I'm wondering, Brie and Tariq, if you could share how it shows up in your life, in the decisions you make when it comes to aligning your faith and the economic decisions, investments, or buying decisions that you make. How does that play out for each of you?
You go first. You always have such great things to say.
Uh, I, well, I think first I've made the great sin for the last 15 years of being a consultant. But within that world, especially in the sustainability and corporate sustainability space, I think what I've learned is where my faith shows up most is when I've started with saying no. So we've, worked as a consultancy with organizations that, revenues anywhere from between $3 million to $2.7 billion. And we've worked on advising central banks on green taxonomy frameworks. We're working with large European development institutions at the moment, also on helping them figure out how do they bring a well-being economy to their lending and their financing. And I think within that, the operating question has always been of transformation and regeneration rather than growth. That's been, one way we've tried to really bring our theology. And the other is, what are we comfortable with walking away from? And I think that's where our values are tested most, especially in our work and the work that we do. It's, it's not in the mission statement. It's not in the daily decisions. It's what are we able to really walk away from that is the biggest expression of our faith. And one concrete example that's very living and real for me now is I serve as the Islamic finance advisor to Greenpeace MENA, and we're currently running a co-divestment campaign in the Islamic finance industry. And the thinking is that Islamic finance at the moment, on paper, of course, is supposed to uphold, all the principles that I shared. It's supposed to protect, life. It's supposed to protect health. It's supposed to protect communities. It's supposed to protect the environment. And yet, coal is still considered permissible to invest in. And it was considered permissible to invest in on the lens of economic justice. But obviously, given, 8 million people die from coal, in every 2 to 3 years, we know that cost is disproportionate. We know that it also disproportionately affects Muslim communities. So we're now currently engaging Shia scholars directly with medical evidence from Muslim majority countries on how coal violates the very principle of life, the very principle of no harm in Islamic finance, and looking to actually get coal taken away from, the ethical screening criteria and to make sure that Islamic finance deems it impermissible. It's one fossil fuel. And of course, there's many fossil fuel that are out there, but it's one in which there are alternatives, one in which we do have renewable alternatives, and it's one in which I think is a very direct expression of the kind of work that we really need to do. If a financial system that is tied to faith is to invest, is to participate in an economic system, very simply, how can it in a way that destroys millions of human lives? And it's something in which we're trying to build a case for, and we're very excited to work with many partners on that journey over the next few years.
Thank you, Tariq. Yeah, Brie, would love to hear your thoughts. How does your faith show up in your economic values as you live your life day to day out there in Los Angeles?
So, as I said before, I was born in the Philippines, and when we came back to the US when I was just a toddler, we were very poor. My family's one main asset was a 1970s or maybe or late 60s Dodge that we called the bomb, not because it was awesome, because that wasn't the language then, but because it backfired all the time. So it sounded explosive and it had rust and various coats of primer, and it was just a terrible car. And my mom would drive my sister and I around. My dad was um, in residency at the time to become a doctor. And so she would drive us around and we would go to anything that was free. So we saw all sorts of, museums on their free days and community plays when they were free. Or the high school was putting something on. So one day we pulled into a high school and we park and my mom walks us up to the ticket booth and she sees that the tickets are more than money, more than she has. And she asked the guy behind the ticket counter if they have a kid's price. And he says no. And so she walks away. Start to walk to our car, and he runs after her and he goes, "For you, we'll give you a kid's price." And my mom was broken with humiliation. Um, and so we didn't see the play. And there are these stages that Maimonides has about charity. And the sort of least generous, the least good form of charity is when one gives something unwillingly. Right. And so what he was kind of doing was was showing himself to be a good moral person, right? Um, but in a way that really made my mom feel humiliated. Um, and the greatest form of charity that Maimonides says is to enable somebody to become self-sufficient, right? To give them the things that they need in order to live, to strengthen their hands, right? So that they're not dependent on others. And so I think that's why I'm an educator, right? Like why ultimately at the end of the day, why I engage in things like capacity building or peace building, um, or even education in a university setting is because I believe that the best that you can do with your talents is to enable somebody else to grow into who they can become without dependence or reliance on others. And so that it's a really great list of the sort of laws of charity because they go through helping to preserve the dignity of the person who is receiving and also the gift of the person who is giving. And so that's and I'm not Jewish, but I went to a Jewish seminary for graduate school. I was the only non-Jew there. And part of what has enriched my life is my engagement with the Jewish tradition.
Brie, what a beautiful story. I'm curious how that upbringing impacted the way you look at money today. I mean, because we know that the habits and values and thoughts about money are inherited from from our parents and grandparents. So it runs in our DNA. So I'm just curious how you look at money today. Like, are they evil or good? Do you? Yeah, I mean, yeah. How is your relationship with money today?
No, I mean, I don't think about money as being evil or good. I don't even think about people as being evil or good. I think about the their defaults and then their range, right? So what is their default mode? Is their default mode charity, generosity, goodness, and then what they're capable of? What is the range of action that they're capable of? So no, I mean I think that money can be a tremendous tool for transformation. I had a mentor, I did a lot of fundraising when I ran centers at universities because that's what you do. And I had a mentor in the fundraising world, and he said to me, if money solves it, it's not a problem. And I was like, oh my gosh. I had no idea but because what he was basically saying is problems are much more intricate and what he was saying is that problems are much more intricate and interrelated than the simple issue of resources, right? And resources can be found, right? The person who ran my center before me, Don Miller, he said money follows good ideas. And so you just need to keep having good ideas. And so I don't think it's bad. I had another friend who was really a political fundraiser, and she said, you know, the problem with tainted money is there taint enough of it. Which I thought was hysterical. And she said, how do you take money that is, you know, it maybe comes from sources that are not the best, and then you transform the money by doing something tremendous with it. And obviously, I think there are limits to that kind of thinking. But the idea that we can find, I think the thing that people risk is that when they develop a moral compass, that there's no way that the world can live up to that morality, right? Because there's no line, there's no aisle in Home Depot where we can build from the things that are not tainted by the generations before us. There are no materials, there are no institutions, there is no land, there is no thing that is not uncomplicated by a twisted moral past. So the only thing you can do is try to make it better, more moral. What guides me the most is like I have a really clear moral compass, and my moral compass is that when I was in Chicago, I was at the University of Chicago, and I lived in the neighborhood next to the University of Chicago, which is bordered by parks, so it's really isolated. And in my neighborhood, the the average lifespan was 15 years higher than the neighborhood outside of the borders of the University of Chicago, which meant that everything that the university was a world leader on, every social determinant of health, right, that we were a world leader on, the immediate neighborhood didn't benefit from. And obviously, they were not the only actor in that neighborhood. But what is a the only thing that you can't mess around with measurement is birth and death, right? Every other form of measurement, you can change definitions, etc. But birth and death are very, very clear. So if we are creating a society that has a 15-year level of discrepancy in the lifespan, we are comfortable with a level of injustice that is the difference between a developed world and a developing world country within a mile or two of each other. And so, what is our obligation? Our obligation is to make sure that people don't die of war, disease, suicide, gun violence, right? That we should prolong the lifespan of people so that they die of old age, right? So like what it's the easiest thing to articulate, right? Are we doing things that prolong the lives of people so that they die of old age and natural causes? Or are we doing things that create this unjust uh, this unjust scale where people are disparately impacted and their lifespan is dictated by their zip code or their latitude. And so it's so simple, right? It's so simple. It's not a complicated thing. And it doesn't mean that every decision that I make affirms that, but it means that I understand what the North Star is, right? I understand what guides my actions. And it's a pretty simple one, right? Is it better for us or is it worse for us? Right? Doesn't mean that I'm not going to build with pure material and uncomplicated systems, but do I make them better? Do we inch closer to the world where people all die at 90 of old age in rocking chairs or not?
I love that so much, the simplicity of that idea, Brie, and also your framing that your mentor told you that, money follows good ideas. And so, Tariq, I'm wondering if I can throw it to you as we're wrapping up the conversation. We've spoken about a lot of ideas here today, a lot of principles, a lot of values. And if we look out into the world right now, the polycrisis of inequality, climate change, debt, displacement, migration, they're all, as Brie was saying earlier, all deeply interconnected. What's one value or one idea that you feel needs to be out in the world today to address these issues and to really foster this faith and business collaboration that we've been talking about?
One idea that I think can't speak for the world, I can only speak for myself and I think and how I wish to show up, is the concept of al-mizan within the Islamic tradition, which is a term that comes from the Quran, and literally it means balance. And the Quran uses it not as a legal term, but as a cosmological principle. that the world is held in balance in the womb of compassion and creation, and that our task is to preserve that balance and not to keep extracting from it. And very simply, the principle is when systems are out of balance, you correct it, and you correct it through restoration, not more growth. You correct it through compassion, not more violence. And that very, simple principle that the world was created with al-mizan, with balance, and that is our role to preserve that balance in natural systems, economic systems, and the balance within our communities is something that is fundamental. And for me, as you as an individual, as you show up and work in the world, are you contributing to balance, or are you contributing to imbalance in your community and the lives of those around you?
Thank you. Brie, any big or small ideas that you feel really needs to be put out in the world today?
It's funny because I love the idea of what Tariq has just said. And I also it makes me a little anxious. And it's not because of the way Tariq described it or how it works as an Islamic tradition. It's because we've taken the notion of balance and made it a new thing to strive for that makes me feel like I'm about to topple over. And that's not what Tariq's talking about. What Tariq's talking about is what, in the Buddhist tradition would be considered harmony, right? The idea that you should have a sort of peaceful coexistence of nature and communities, of compassion, of mindfulness, of where the ego sits and all of that, right? And I love the way that Tariq describes this notion in his tradition. And I hear, as a woman who is a mother who has has a job and a career, this notion of trying to create balance of it, which makes me feel like another burden, which is not at all what Tariq is talking about. And so what I like to think about is how uh, life is harmonious, right? Only or melodic, right? Not because I don't want to have another um, metric that I'm failing at doing, right? If you are imbalanced, then it falls apart and things fall over. And the reality is, if you play a note that's off in harmony, it can lead to other notes. And so I like the melodic or harmonious understanding of things because it makes me feel like there's more room for improvisation and jazz than the notion that balance provides me, which feels like another way that I am both strapped with a metric and also not achieving it. And that is not what Tariq is talking about. It's just the use of the word has a different connotation in my life as a woman who's trying to have it all. And I have a life that is really harmonious, right? I have a life that creates this like I think a really beautiful piece of music, and sometimes it's fast and sometimes it's slow and sometimes it's, chaotic jazz and sometimes it's like a smooth jam, right? But I think if we could have uh, wider notions of what some of these terms are that allow us to appreciate the range of people and experiences and to, I don't know, create a much more compassionate understanding and a bigger understanding of what it means to do good. And so things that feel constricting for me don't work. So I like it's very much the same concept that Tariq is talking about, the idea of harmoniousness or creating a sense of harmony or melody or music. And so it doesn't have to be a checklist. It doesn't have to be a burden, right? It can be a guide. And I think that people are not really good. One of my professors in graduate school, two quick stories. I was pestering him because I'd come out of a real literal religious tradition. And I was asking him, he's a sociologist of Judaism named Bruce Phillips. And I was like, so did Moses cross the Red Sea or not? And he goes, Bree, there are some things that are true that never happened. And I was like, oh my gosh, my mind is exploding with notions, right? Like what he was saying is the truth of this thing is immaterial to its reality. What it matters is what it's teaching us. And I just thought that was it offered so much richer way of understanding it. And then my one of my mentors at graduate school was a woman named Sharon Gillerman who passed away at the beginning of COVID. And her loss was tremendous because she shaped how I thought on every level. And I used to walk with her. It was her first semester teaching, was my last semester of undergrad. And I would walk from our class, which was late at night, to our cars together. And we'd have these incredible conversations. And I was asking her about something because she was really religious, but she taught at a reform seminary. And I was basically saying something and kind of like pestering her with undergraduate energy about these contradictions that I thought existed in her life. And she turned to me and she put her hand on my arm and she said, Brie, I am comfortable with my contradictions. And I was like, I didn't even know that was allowed. I had no idea that we were allowed to have contradictions, let alone feel okay about them. And what I got from this religious engagement with kind of liberal interpretations of religion and theology um, was not a world that was constricted, but a world that was opened and a world that understood the layers and depths of humanity. And that's what I came to appreciate about religion. Wasn't what people see as this system of rules and things that sort of shrink you down, but things that really expand the way that you can interpret and engage with the world, and that don't require always to be reconciled, right? They don't, contradictions exist, and they exist within all of us. And so, how do you think about them? What do you reconcile with them?
The Sufi tradition that I feel very close to often has a very sort of simple statement that the path of the mystic ultimately is the reconciliation of the irreconcilables, and to be able to do that and to live that is the embodiment of what a mystic is. And it's something I always return to. I feel is very true. Is maybe one of the deepest truths I think we can come closer to. Yeah. So thank you, Brie, as well for sharing and reflecting that.
Wow, I know time is flying. I don't know about you, Gopal, but this conversation could be going on for hours. I wouldn't even mind. But out of respect for your time, I think we would like to propose a final question. We have many, many more for you, but it's always better to feel like that you could ask more questions. And the more you speak, the more questions we actually have for you all. So I hope we can invite you back one day. But we do have one final question, and that is, if you kind of lean back and reflect for a moment, what is, I mean, I know it's a hard question, but if you could see one breakthrough in faith business collaboration on economic justice happen in, let's say, the next year, next 2 years, what would it be, and what would give it hope? What gives you hope to think that this is possible? Is there anything we can see in the horizon that gives us hope that this might happen? I don't know who feels like going first, but that's a question, a burning question from both of us.
I gave the example of what we're working on with Greenpeace MENA and the Islamic finance and coal campaign. And for me, I would love to see a formal Sharia ruling from a jurisprudential body that coal financing violates the Islamic principle of preserving life. The 230,000 premature deaths annually in Muslim communities is too big of a price to pay for a fossil fuel. And for me, I think why I think that's so important is the legal frameworks exist, the principles exist. What is needed in this case is institutional and scholarly courage to both name it and enact on it. And it is a ruling that would shift billions in capital and set a precedent. One for an industry that even 5% going to climate and nature solutions would outweigh all the money that is currently in the loss and damage fund. So it's one that I hope that door will open. The same reasoning obviously applies to other extractive industries, but coal is the most obvious, and I think it's where at least that industry needs to both show that it is ready to be also a compass and an example for the rest of the world that yes, a economic system of that kind can start to really have a very serious conversation and enact on fossil fuels.
I can't think of anything more urgent or important than what Tariq just shared. I mean, it's just remarkable, and it would be a light for the rest of the world.
So, are you hopeful for the future?
Yeah, what do they say in Hebrews 11, right? hope. It's the sort of substance of things hoped for and evidence of things not seen, right? Like that's what faith is. I don't know, I'll say it right, actually. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and proof of not seen. Yes, I'm hopeful because we are not the first generation to have struggled, right? In Pirkei Avot, it says, ours is not to desist from the task, nor is it to see it finished, right? That part of what we do in the chain of humanity is to continue to strive for the betterment of the world. So what do we have other than our striving to offer? And at the same time, I used to take that as sort of, I found solace in it, right? That notion that we're part of this chain of humanity. And now I kind of think of it as a little bit of a warning, basically saying, you stupid people, do you not see, will you not learn the lessons of the last generation before you and make new mistakes rather than the same old ones? I with the contradictions that exist in my life, I am frustrated, I am sad, I am disheartened, and I remain hopeful that we will find a path forward because that's what humanity has always done.
And I think in that same lens, I do believe hope can only coexist if one it does accept the rage. Rage comes from the as a word comes from the medieval Latin rabia, which means fury. And in Arabic etymology, rabia means spring. It symbolizes obviously the beginning of life, of eternal hope. And it's that advent of happiness after a dark winter. And it's also the name of the first female Sufi saint, Rabia al-Basri. And Rabia, in many ways, represented this highest plane of spirituality because she was able to hold both the rage and the hope together, saying that one needed to follow from the other, that one sprang from the other. And it's the emotion and the feeling that I think we're all carrying right now in the world.
I think we have gotten a lot to think about right now, and there's so much to discuss further. But I want to say thank you to both of you for coming. It has been such a pleasure. So thank you very much for being here. I'm Sulaima Gorani and the proud host of this podcast together with...
And I'm Gopal Patel. Thank you both for being with us. Thank you to our listeners. And thank you for joining us for this episode of the Faith in Action podcast.